Chapter 11 of The Life Everlasting by Marie Corelli. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Lisa Statler. One Way of Love. When I left Oxford, he said, as I told you before, I left what I conceived to be slavery, that is, a submissively ordered routine of learning in which there occurred nothing new, nothing hopeful, nothing really serviceable. I mastered all there was to master, and carried away honours, which I deemed hardly worth winning. It was supposed then, most people would suppose it, that as I found myself the possessor of an income of between 5,000 and 6,000 a year, I would naturally live my life, as the phrase goes, and enter upon what is called a social career. Now, to my mind, a social career simply means social sham, and to live my life had always a broader application for me than for the majority of men. So, having ascertained all I could concerning myself and my affairs from my father's London solicitors, and learning exactly how I was situated with regard to finances and what is called the practical side of life, I left England for Egypt, the land where I was born. I had an object in view, and that object was not only to see my own old home, but to find out the whereabouts of a certain great sage and mystic philosopher long known in the East by the name of Heliobas. I started, and the blood rushed to my cheeks in a burning flame. "I think you knew him," he went on, addressing me directly with a straight glance. "You met him some years back, did you not?" I bent my head in silent assent, and saw the eyes of my host and hostess turned upon me in questioning scrutiny. "In a certain circle of students and mystics he was renowned," continued Santoris, "and I resolved to see what he could make of me, what he would advise, and how I should set to work to discover what I had resolved to find. However, at the end of a long and tedious journey I met with disappointment. Heliobas had removed to another sphere of action." "He was dead, you mean?" interposed Mr. Harlan. "Not at all," answered Santoris calmly. "There is no death. To put it quite simply, he had reached the top of his class in this particular school of life and learning, and, therefore, was ready and willing to pass on into the higher grade. He, however, left a successor capable of maintaining the theories he inculcated, a man named Aselzion, who elected to live in an almost inaccessible spot among mountains, with a few followers and disciples. Him I found after considerable difficulty, and we came to understand each other so well that I stayed with him some time, studying all that he deemed needful before I started on my own voyage of discovery. His methods of instruction were arduous and painful. In fact, I may say I went through a veritable ordeal of fire." He broke off, and for a moment seemed absorbed in recollections. "You are speaking, I suppose, of some rule of life, some kind of novitiate, to which you had to submit yourself?" said Mr. Harlan. "Or was it merely a course of study?" "In one sense it was a sort of novitiate or probation," answered Santoris slowly, with the far-away, musing look still in his eyes. "In another it was, as you put it, merely a course of study. Merely! It was a course of study in which every nerve, every muscle, every sinew was tested to its utmost strength, and in which a combat between the spiritual and material was fiercely fought, till the one could master the other so absolutely as to hold it in perfect subjection. Well, I came out of the trial fairly well, strong enough at any rate to stand alone, as I have done ever since." "And to what did your severe ordeal lead?" asked Dr. Brayle, who by this time appeared interested, though still wearing his incredulous, half-sneering air. "To anything which you could not have gained just as easily without it?" Santoris looked straight at him. His keen eyes glowed as though some bright fire of the soul had leapt into them. "In the first place," he answered, "it led me to power. power not only over myself, but over all things small and great that surround or concern my being. I think you will admit that if a man takes up any line of business, it is necessary for him to understand all its technical methods and practical details. My business was and is life, the one thing that humanity never studies and therefore fails to master. Mr. Harlan looked up. "Life is mysterious and inexplicable," he said. "We cannot tell why we live. No one can fathom that mystery. We are here through no conscious desire of our own, and again we are not here, just as we have learned to accommodate ourselves to the fact of being anywhere." "True," answered Santoris, "but to understand the why of life, we must first of all realize that its origin is love. Love creates life because it must. Even agnostics, when pushed to the wall in argument, grant that some mysterious and mighty force is at the back of creation, a force which is both intelligent and beneficent. The trite saying, 'God is love,' is true enough, but it is quite as true to say 'love is God.' The commencement of universes, solar systems, and worlds is the desire of love to express itself. No more and no less than this. From desire springs action, from action life. It only remains for each living unit to bring itself into harmonious union with this one fundamental law of the whole cosmos, the expression and action of love, which is based, as naturally it must be, on a dual entity." "What do you mean by that?" asked Dr. Brayle. "As a physician, and I presume as a scientist, you ought scarcely to ask," replied Santoris with a slight smile. "For you surely know that there is no single thing in the universe. The very microbes of disease or health go in pairs. Light and darkness, the up and the down, the right and the left, the storm and the calm, the male and the female. All things are dual, and the sorrows of humanity are for the most part the result of ill-assorted numbers, figures brought together that will not count up properly, wrong halves of the puzzle that will never fit into place. The mischief runs through all civilization, wrong halves of races brought together which do not and never can assimilate, and in an individual personal sense, wrong halves of spirit and matter are often forced together, which are bound by law to separate in time, with some attendant disaster. The error is caused by the obstinate miscomprehension of man himself as to the nature and extent of his own powers and faculties. He forgets that he is not 'as the beasts that perish,' but that he has the breath of God in him, that he holds within himself the seed of immortality which is perpetually recreative. He is bound by all the laws of the universe to give that immortal life its dual entity and attendant power, without which he cannot attain his highest ends. It may take him thousands of years, cycles of time, but it has to be done. Materially speaking, he may perhaps consider that he has secured his dual entity by a pleasing or fortunate marriage, but if he is not spiritually mated, his marriage is useless, aye, worse than useless, as it only interposes fresh obstacles between himself and his intended progress." "Marriage can hardly be called a useless institution," said Dr. Brayle with an uplifting of his sinister brows. "It helps to populate the world." "It does," answered Santoris calmly, "but if the pairs that are joined in marriage have no spiritual bond between them, and nothing beyond the attraction of the mere body, they people the world with more or less incapable, unthinking and foolish creatures like themselves. And supposing these to be born in tens of millions, like ants or flies, they will not carry on the real purpose of man's existence to anything more than that stoppage and recoil which is called death, but which in reality is only a turning back of the wheels of time when the right road has been lost, and it becomes imperative to begin the journey all over again." We sat silent. No one had any comment to offer. "We are arriving at that same old turning point once more," he continued. "The Western civilization of 2000 years, assisted, and sometimes impeded, by the teachings of Christianity, is nearing its end. Out of the vast wreckage of nations, now imminent, only a few individuals can be saved, and the storm is so close at hand that one can almost hear the mutterings of the thunder. But why should I, or you, or anyone else think about it? We have our own concerns to attend to, and we attend to these so well that we forget all the most vital necessities that should make them of any importance. However, in this day nothing matters. Shall I go on with my own story, or have you heard enough?" "Not half enough," said Catherine Harlan quite suddenly. She had scarcely spoken before, but she now leaned forward, looking eagerly interested. "You speak of power over yourself. Do you possess the same power over others?" "Not unless they come into my own circle of action," he answered. "It would not be worth my while to exert any influence on persons who are, and ever must be, indifferent to me. I can, of course, defend myself against enemies, and that without lifting a hand." Everyone, save myself, looked at him inquisitively, but he did not explain his meaning. He went on very quietly with his own personal narrative. "As I have told you," he said, "I came out of my studies with Aselzion successfully enough to feel justified in going on with my work alone. I took up my residence in Egypt in my father's old home, a pretty place enough with wide pleasure grounds planted thickly with palm trees and richly filled with flowers, and here I undertook the mastery and comprehension of the most difficult subject ever propounded for learning, the most evasive, complex yet exact piece of mathematics ever set out for solving. Myself! Myself was my puzzle. How to unite myself with nature so thoroughly as to insinuate myself into her secrets, possess all she could offer me, and yet detach myself from self so completely as to be ready to sacrifice all I had gained at a moment's notice, should that moment come." "You are paradoxical," said Mr. Harland irritably. "What's the use of gaining anything if it is to be lost at a moment's bidding?" "It is the only way to hold and keep whatever there is to win," answered Santoris calmly. "And the paradox is no greater than that of 'He that loveth his life shall lose it.' The only moment of supreme self-surrender is love. When that comes, everything else must go. Love alone can compass life, perfect it, complete it, and carry it on to eternal happiness. But please bear in mind that I am speaking of real love, not mere physical attraction. The two things are as different as light from darkness." "Is your curious conception or ideal of love the reason why you have never married?" asked Brayle abruptly. "Precisely!" replied Santoris. "It is most unquestionably and emphatically the reason why I have never married." There was a pause. I saw Catherine glancing at him with a strange furtiveness in which there was something of fear. "You have never met your ideal, I suppose?" she asked with a faint smile. "Oh yes, I've met her," he answered, "ages ago. On many occasions I have met her. Sometimes she has estranged herself from me, sometimes she has been torn from me by others, and still more often I have, through my own folly and obstinacy, separated myself from her. But our mutual mistakes do no more than delay the inevitable union at last." Here he spoke slowly and with marked meaning. "For it is an inevitable union, as inevitable as that of two electrons which, after spinning in space for certain periods of time, rush together at last and remain so indissolubly united that nothing can ever separate them." "And then?" queried Dr. Brayle with an ironical air. "Then? Why, everything is possible then. Beauty, perfection, wisdom, progress, creativeness, and a world, even worlds, of splendid thought and splendid ideals, bound to lead to still more splendid realization. It is not difficult to imagine two brains, two minds moving so absolutely in unison that like a grand chord of music they strike harmony through hitherto dumb life episodes." But think of two immortal souls full of a love as deathless as themselves, conjoined in highest effort and superb attainment, the love of angel for angel, of God for God. You think this ideal imaginative, transcendental, impossible. Yet I swear to you, it is the most real possibility in this fleeting mirage of a world." His voice thrilled with a warmth of feeling and conviction, and as I heard him speak I trembled inwardly with a sudden remorse, a quick sense of inferiority and shame. Why could I not let myself go? Why did I not give the fluttering spirit within me room to expand its wings? Something opposing, something inimical to my peace and happiness held me back, and presently I began to wonder whether I should attribute it to the influence of those with whom I was temporarily associated. I was almost confirmed in this impression when Mr. Harlan's voice, harsh and caustic as it could be when he was irritated or worsted in an argument, broke the momentary silence. "You are more impossible now than you ever were at Oxford, Santoris," he said. "You out-transcend all transcendentalism. You know, or you ought to know by this time, that there is no such thing as an immortal soul. And if you believe otherwise, you have brought yourself voluntarily into that state of blind credulity. All science teaches us that we are the mere spawn of the planet on which we live. We are here to make the best of it for ourselves and for others who come after us, and there's an end. What is called love is the mere physical attraction between the two sexes, no more, and it soon palls. All that we gain we quickly cease to care for. It is the way of humanity." "What a poor creation humanity is then!" said Santoris with a smile. "How astonishing that it should exist at all for no higher aims than those of the ant or the mouse! My dear Harlan, if your beliefs were really sound, we should be bound in common duty and charity to stop the population of the world altogether, for the whole business is useless and even cruel, for it is nothing but a crime to allow people to be born for no other end than extinction. However, keep your creeds. I thank heaven they are not mine." Mr. Harlan gave a slight movement of impatience. I could see that he was disturbed in his mind. "Let's talk of something I can follow," he said. "The personal and material side of things. Your perennial condition of health, for example. Your apparent youth." "Oh, is it only apparent?" laughed Santoris gaily. "Well, to those who never knew me in my boyhood's days, and are therefore never hurling me back to their 30 years or more ago of friendship, etc., my youth seems very actual. You see, their non-ability to count up the time I have spent on earth obliges them to accept me at my own valuation. There's really nothing to explain in the matter. Everyone can keep young if he understands himself and nature. If I were to tell you the literal truth of the process, you would not believe me, and even if you did, you would not have the patience to carry it out. But what does it matter after all, if we only live for the express purpose of dying? The sooner we get the business over and done with, the better. Youth itself has no charms under such circumstances. All the purposes of life, however lofty and nobly planned, are bound to end in nothingness, and it is hardly worth while taking the trouble to breathe the murderous air." He spoke with a kind of passion. His eyes were luminous, his face transfigured with an almost superhuman glow, and we all looked at him in something of amazement. Mr. Harlan fidgeted uneasily in his chair. "You go too far," he said. "Life is agreeable as long as it lasts." "Have you found it so?" Santoris interrupted him. "Has it not, even in your pursuit and attainment of wealth, brought you more pain than pleasure? Number up all the possibilities of life, from the existence of the labourer in his hut to that of the king on his throne. They are none of them worth striving for or keeping if death is the ultimate end. Ambition is merest folly, wealth a temporary possession of perishable goods which must pass to others, fame a brief noise of one's name in mouths that will soon be dumb, and love sex attraction only. What a treacherous and criminal act, then, is this creation of universes! What mad folly! What sheer, blind, reasonless wickedness! There was a silence. His eyes flashed from one to the other of us. "Can you deny it?" he demanded. "Can you find any sane, logical reason for the continuance of life which is to end in utter extinction, or for the creation of worlds doomed to eternal destruction?" No one spoke. "You have no answer ready," he said, and smiled. "Naturally, for an answer is impossible. And here you have the key to what you consider my mystery. The mystery of keeping young instead of growing old, the secret of living instead of dying. It is simply the conscious practical realization that there is no death, but only change. That is the first part of the process. Change, or transmutation and transformation of the atoms and elements of which we are composed, is going on forever without a second's cessation. It began when we were born, and before we were born, and the art of living young consists simply in using one's soul and willpower to guide this process of change towards the ends we desire, instead of leaving it to blind chance and to the association with inimical influences which interfere with our best actions. For example, I, a man in sound health and condition, realize that with every moment some change is working in me towards some end. It rests entirely with myself as to whether the change shall be towards continuance of health or towards admission of disease, towards continuance of youth or towards the encouragement of age, towards life as it presents itself to me now, or towards some other phase of life as I perceive it in the future. I can advance or retard myself as I please, the proper management of myself being my business. If I should suffer pain or illness, I am very sure it will be chiefly through my own fault. If I invite decay and decrepitude, it will be because I allow these forces to encroach upon my well-being. In fact, briefly, I am what I will to be. And all the laws that brought me into existence support me in this attitude of mind, body, and spirit. "If we could all become what we would be," said Dr. Brayle, "we should attain the millennium." "Are you sure of that?" queried Santoris. "Would it not rather depend on the particular choice each one of us might make? You, for example, might wish to be something that would hardly tend to your happiness, and your wish being obtained, you might become what, if you had only realized it, you would give worlds not to be. Some men desire to be thieves, even murderers, and become so, but the end of their desires is not perhaps what they imagined." "Can you read people's thoughts?" asked Catherine suddenly. Santoris looked amused. He replied by a counter question. "Would you be sorry if I could?" She flushed a little. I smiled, knowing what was in her mind. "It would be a most unpleasant accomplishment, that of reading the thoughts of others," said Mr. Harlan. "I would rather not cultivate it." "But Mr. Santoris almost implies that he possesses it," said Dr. Brayle, with a touch of irritation in his manner. "And, after all, thought reading is a kind of society amusement nowadays. There is nothing very difficult in it." "Nothing indeed," agreed Santoris lightly. "And being as easy as it is, why do you not show us at once that antique piece of jewellery you have in your pocket? You brought it with you this evening to show to me and ask my opinion of its value, did you not?" Brayle's eyes opened in utter amazement. If ever a man was taken completely by surprise, he was. "How did you know?" he began stammeringly, while Mr. Harlan, equally astonished, stared at him through his round spectacles as though challenging some defiance. Santoris laughed. "Thought reading is only a society amusement, as you have just observed," he said, "and I have been amusing myself with it for the last few minutes. Come, let us see your treasure." Dr. Brayle was thoroughly embarrassed, but he tried to cover his confusion by an awkward laugh. "Well, you have made a very clever hit," he said. "Quite a random shot, of course, which by mere coincidence went to its mark. It's quite true I have brought with me a curious piece of jewel work which I always carry about wherever I go, and something moved me tonight to ask your opinion of its value, as well as to place its period. It is old Italian, but even experts are not agreed as to its exact date." He put his hand in his breast pocket and drew out a small silk bag, from which he took with great care a collar of jewels, designed in a kind of chainwork which made it perfectly flexible. He laid it out on the table, and I bit my lip hard to suppress an involuntary exclamation, for I had seen the thing before, and for the immediate moment could not realize where, till a sudden flash of light through the cells of my brain reminded me of that scene of love and death in the vision of the artist's studio, when the name Cosimo de Medici had been whispered like an evil omen. The murderer in that dream picture had worn a collar of jewels precisely similar to the one I now saw. But I could only keep silence and listen with every nerve strained to utmost attention, while Santoris took the ornament in his hand and looked at it with an intent earnestness, in which there was almost a touch of compassion. "A beautiful piece of workmanship," he said at last, slowly, while Mr. Harlan, Catherine, and Swinton, the secretary, all drew up closer to him at the table and leaned eagerly forward. "And I should say," here he raised his eyes and looked full at the dark, brooding, sinister face of Braille, "I should say that it belonged to the Medici period. It must have been part of the dress of a nobleman of that time. The design seems to me to be Florentine. Perhaps if these jewels could speak they might tell a strange story. They are unhappy stones." "Unhappy!" exclaimed Catherine. "You mean unlucky?" "No, there is no such thing as luck," answered Santoris quietly, turning the collar over and over in his hands. "Not for either jewels or men. But there is unhappiness. And unhappiness simply means life being put to wrong uses. I call these gems unhappy because they have been wrongfully used. A precious stone is a living thing. It absorbs influences as the earth absorbs light, and these jewels have absorbed some sense of evil that renders them less beautiful than they might be. These diamonds and rubies, these emeralds and sapphires, have not the full lustre of their own true nature. They are in the condition of pining flowers. It will take centuries before they resume their natural brilliancy. There is some tragedy hidden among them." Dr. Brayle looked amused. "Well, I can give you no history of them," he said. "A friend of mine bought the collar from an old Jew curiosity dealer in a back street of Florence and sent it to me to wear with a Florentine dress at a fancy dress ball. Curiously enough, I chose to represent one of the Medicis, some artist having told me my features resembled their type of countenance. That's the chronicle, so far as I am concerned. I rather liked it on account of its antiquity. I could have sold it many times over, but I have no desire to part with it." "Naturally!" and Santoris passed on the collar to everyone to examine. "You feel a sense of proprietorship in it." Catherine Harland had the trinket in her hand, and a curious vague look of terror came over her face as she presently passed it back to its owner. But she made no remark, and it was Mr. Harland who resumed the conversation. "That's an odd idea of yours about unhappy jewels," he said. "Perhaps the misfortune attending the possessors of the famous Blue Hope diamond could be traced to some early tragedy connected with it." "Unquestionably," replied Santoris. "Now look at this." And he drew from his watch pocket a small fine gold chain to which was attached a moonstone of singular size and beauty set in a circle of diamonds. "Here is a sort of talismanic jewel. It has never known any disastrous influences, nor has it been disturbed by malevolent surroundings. It is a perfectly happy, unsullied gem. As you see, the lustre is perfect, as clear as that of a summer moon in heaven. Yet it is a very old jewel and has seen more than 1,000 years of life." We all examined the beautiful ornament, and as I held it in my hand a moment, it seemed to emit tiny sparks of luminance, like a flash of moonlight on rippling waves. "Women should take care that their jewels are made happy," he continued, looking at me with a slight smile. That is, if they want them to shine. Nothing that lives is at its best, unless it is in a condition of happiness, a condition which, after all, is quite easy to attain." "Easy? I should have thought nothing was so difficult," said Mr. Harland. "Nothing certainly is so difficult in the ordinary way of life men choose to live," answered Santoris. "For the most part they run after the shadow and forsake the light. Even in work and the creative action of thought, each ordinary man imagines that his especial work being all important, it is necessary for him to sacrifice everything to it. And he does. If he is filled with worldly ambition and selfish concentration, and he produces something, anything, which frequently proves to be ephemeral as gossamer dust, it is only when work is the outcome of a great love and keen sympathy for others that it lasts and keeps its influence. Now, we have talked enough about all these theories, which are not interesting to anyone who is not prepared to accept them. Shall we go up on deck?" We all rose at once, Santoris holding out a box of cigars to the men to help themselves. Catherine and I preceded them up the saloon stairs to the deck, which was now like a sheet of silver in the light shed by one of the loveliest moons of the year. The water around was sparkling with phosphorescence, and the dark mountains looked higher and more imposing than ever, rising as they seemed to do, sheer up from the white splendour of the sea. I leaned over the deck rail, gazing down into the deep liquid mirror of stars below, and my heart was heavy and full of a sense of bitterness and tears. Catherine had dropped languidly into a chair, and was leaning back in it with a strange, far-away expression on her tired face. Suddenly she spoke with an almost mournful gentleness. "Do you like his theories?" I turned towards her inquiringly. "I mean, do you like the idea of there being no death, and that we only change from one life to another and so on forever?" she continued. "To me it is appalling. Sometimes I think death the kindest thing that can happen, especially for women." I was in the mood to agree with her. I went up to her and knelt down by her side. "Yes," I said, and I felt the tremor of tears in my voice. "Yes, for women death often seems very kind. When there is no love and no hope of love, when the world is growing grey and the shadows are deepening towards night, when the ones we most dearly love misjudge and mistrust us, and their hearts are closed against our tenderness, then death seems the greatest god of all, one before whom we may well kneel and offer up our prayers. Who would live forever quite alone in an eternity without love? Oh, how much kinder, how much sweeter would be utter extinction!" My voice broke, and Catherine, moved by some sudden womanly impulse, put her arm round me. "Why, you are crying!" she said softly. "What is it? You, who are always so bright and happy!" I quickly controlled the weakness of my tears. "Yes, it is foolish," I said, "but I feel tonight as if I had wasted a good part of my life in useless research, and looking for what has been, after all, quite close to my hand, only that I failed to see it, and that I must go back upon the road I thought I had passed." Here I paused. I saw she could not understand me. "Catherine," I went on abruptly, "will you let me leave you in a day or two? I have been quite a fortnight with you on board the 'Diana,' and I think I have had enough holiday. I should like," and I looked up at her from where I knelt, "I should like to part from you while we remain good friends, and I have an idea that perhaps we shall not agree so well if we learn to know more of each other." She bent her eyes upon me with a half frightened expression. "How strange you should think that!" she murmured. "I have felt the same, and yet I really like you very much. I always liked you. I wish you would believe it." I smiled. "Dear Catherine," I said, "it is no use shutting our eyes to the fact that while there is something which attracts us to each other, there is also something which repels. We cannot argue about it or analyse it. Such mysterious things do occur, and they are beyond our searching out." "But," she interrupted quickly, We were not so troubled by these mysterious things till we met this man Santoris." She broke off, and I rose to my feet, as just then Santoris approached, accompanied by Mr. Harlan and the others. "I have suggested giving you a sail by moonlight before you leave," he said. "It will be an old experience for you under new conditions. Sailing by moonlight in an ordinary sense is an ordinary thing, but sailing by moonlight with the moonlight as part of our motive power has perhaps a touch of originality." As he spoke, he made a sign to one of his men who came up to receive his orders, which were given in too low a tone for us to hear. Easy deck chairs were placed for all the party, and we were soon seated in a group together, somewhat silently at first, our attention being entirely riveted on the wonderful, almost noiseless way in which the sails of the 'Dream' were unfurled. There was no wind, the night was warm and intensely still, the sea absolutely calm. Like broad white wings, the canvas gradually spread out under the deft, quick hands of the sailors employed in handling it. The anchor was drawn up in the same swift and silent manner. Then there came an instant's pause. Mr. Harland drew his cigar from his mouth and looked up amazed, as we all did, at the mysterious way in which the sails filled out, pulling the cordage tightly into bands of iron strength. And none of us could restrain an involuntary cry of wonder and admiration as their whiteness began to glitter with the radiance of hoarfrost, the strange luminance deepening in intensity till it seemed as if the whole stretch of canvas from end to end of the magnificent schooner was a mass of fine jewel work sparkling under the moon. "Well, however much I disagree with your theories of life, Santoris," said Mr. Harland, "I will give you full credit for this extraordinary yacht of yours. It's the most wonderful thing I ever saw, and you are a wonderful fellow to have carried out such a unique application of science. You ought to impart your secret to the world." Santoris laughed lightly. "And the world would take 100 years or more to discuss it, consider it, deny it, and finally accept it," he said. "No, one grows tired of asking the world to be either wise or happy. It prefers its own way, just as I prefer mine. It will discover the method of sailing without wind, and it will learn how to make every sort of mechanical progress without steam in time, but not in our day. And I, personally, cannot afford to wait while it is slowly learning its ABC like a big child under protest. You see, we're going now." We were going indeed. It would have been more correct to say we were flying. Over the still water our vessel glided like a moving, beautiful shape of white fire, swiftly and steadily, with no sound save the little hissing murmur of the water cleft under her keel. And then, like a sudden whisper from fairyland, came the ripple of harp strings, running upward in phrases of exquisite melody, and a boy's voice, clear, soft and full, began to sing with a pure enunciation which enabled us to hear every word. "Sailing, sailing, whither? What path of the flashing sea seems best for you and me? No matter the way, by night or day, so long as we sail together. Sailing, sailing, whither? Into the rosy grace of the sun's deep setting place. We need not know how far we go, so long as we sail together. Sailing, sailing, whither? To the glittering rainbow strand of love's enchanted land. We ask not where, in earth or air, so long as we sail together. Sailing, sailing, whither? On to the life divine, your soul made one with mine. In heaven or hell, all must be well, so long as we sail together." The song finished with a passionate chord which, played as it was with swift intensity, seemed to awaken a response from the sea. At any rate, a strange shivering echo trembled upward as it were from the water and floated into the spacious silence of the night. My heart beat with uncomfortable quickness, and my eyes grew hot with the weight of suppressed tears. Why could I not escape from the cruel, restraining force that held my real self prisoner, as with manacles of steel? I could not even speak, and while the others were clapping their hands in delighted applause at the beauty of both voice and song, I sat silent. "He sings well," said Santoris. "He is the Eastern lad you saw when you came on deck this morning. I brought him from Egypt. He will give us another song presently. Shall we walk a little?" We rose and paced the deck slowly, gradually dividing into couples. Catherine and Dr. Brayle, Mr. Harlan and his secretary, Santoris and myself. We two paused together at the stern of the vessel, looking towards the bowsprit, which seemed to pierce the distance of sea and sky like a flying arrow. "You wish to speak to me alone?" said Santoris then, "do you not? Though I know what you want to say." I glanced at him with a touch of defiance. "Then I need not speak," I answered. "No, you need not speak unless you give utterance to what is in your true soul," he said. "I would rather you did not play at conventions with me." For the moment I felt almost angry. "I do not play at conventions," I murmured. "Oh, do you not? Is that quite candid?" I raised my eyes and met his. He was smiling. Some of the oppression in my soul suddenly gave way, and I spoke hurriedly in a low tone. "Surely you know how difficult it is for me," I said. "Things have happened so strangely, and we are surrounded here by influences that compel conventionality. I cannot speak to you as frankly as I would under other circumstances. It is easy for you to be yourself. You have gained the mastery over all lesser forces than your own. But with me it is different. Perhaps when I am away I shall be able to think more calmly." "You are going away?" he asked gently. "Yes, it is better so." He remained silent. I went on quickly. "I am going away because I feel inadequate and unable to cope with my present surroundings. I have had some experience of the same influences before. I know I have." "I also," he interrupted. "Well, you must realize this better than I," and I looked at him now with greater courage. "And if you have, you know they have led to trouble. I want you to help me." "I to help you?" he said. "How can I help you when you leave me?" There was something infinitely sad in his voice, and the old fear came over me like a chill, lest I should lose what I had gained. "If I leave you," I said tremblingly, "I do so because I am not worthy to be with you. Oh, can you not see this in me?" For as I spoke he took my hand in his and held it with a kindly clasp. "I am so self-willed, so proud, so unworthy. There are 1,000 things I would say to you, but I dare not here or now." "No one will approach us," he said, still holding my hand. "I am keeping the others, unconsciously to themselves, at a distance, till you have finished speaking. Tell me some of these 1,000 things." I looked up at him and saw the deep lustre of his eyes filled with a great tenderness. He drew me a little closer to his side. "Tell me," he persisted softly, "is there very much that we do not, if we are true to each other, know already?" "You know more than I do," I answered, "and I want to be equal with you. I do! I cannot be content to feel that I am groping in the dark weakly and blindly, while you are in the light, strong and self-contained. You can help me, and you will help me. You will tell me where I should go and study as you did, with Aselzion." He started back, amazed. "With Aselzion? Dear, forgive me! You are a woman! It is impossible that you should suffer so great an ordeal, so severe a strain. And why should you attempt it? If you would let me, I would be sufficient for you." "But I will not let you!" I said, quickly roused to a kind of defiant energy. "I wish to go to the very source of your instruction, and then I shall see where I stand with regard to you. If I stay here now—" "It will be the same old story over again," he said. "Love and mistrust, then drifting apart in the same weary way. Is it not possible to avoid the errors of the past?" "No," I said resolutely. "For me it is not possible. I cannot yield to my own inward promptings. They offer me too much happiness. I doubt the joy, I fear the glory." My voice trembled. The very clasp of his hand unnerved me. "I will tell you," he said, after a brief pause, "what you feel. You are perfectly conscious that between you and myself there is a tie which no power, earthly or heavenly, can break. But you are living in a matter-of-fact world with matter-of-fact persons, and the influence they exert is to make you incredulous of the very truths which are an essential part of your spiritual existence. I understand all this. I understand also why you wish to go to the house of Aselzion, and you shall go." I uttered an exclamation of relief and pleasure. His eyes grew dark with earnest gravity as he looked at me. "You are pleased at what you cannot realize," he said slowly. "If you go to the house of Aselzion, and I see you are determined, it will be a matter of such vital import that it can only mean one of two things: your entire happiness or your entire misery. I cannot contemplate with absolute calmness the risk you run, and yet it is better that you should follow the dictates of your own soul than be as you are now, irresolute, uncertain of yourself, and ready to lose all you have gained." To lose all I had gained? The old insidious terror. I met his searching gaze imploringly. "I must not lose anything," I said, and my voice sank lower. "I cannot bear to lose you." His hand closed on mine with a tighter grasp. "Yet you doubt," he said softly. "I must know," I said resolutely. He lifted his head with a proud gesture that was curiously familiar to me. "So the old spirit is not dead in you, my queen," he said, smiling. "The old indomitable will, the desire to probe to the very centre of things. Yet love defies analysis, and it is the only thing that binds the universe together. A fact beyond all proving, a truth which cannot be expounded by any given rule or line, but which is the most emphatic force of life. My queen, it is a force that must either bend or break you." I made no reply. He still held my hand, and we looked out together on the shining expanse of the sea where there was no vessel visible, and where our schooner alone flew over the watery moonlit surface like a winged flame. "In your working life," he continued gently, "you have done much. You have thought clearly, and you have not been frightened away from any eternal fact by the difficulties of research. But in your living life you have missed more than you will care to know. You have been content to remain a passive recipient of influences. You have not thoroughly learned how to combine and use them. You have overcome altogether what are generally the chief obstacles in the way of a woman's higher progress: her inherent childishness, her delight in imagining herself wronged or neglected, her absurd way of attaching weighty importance to the merest trifles, her want of balance, and the foolish resentment she feels at being told any of her faults. This is all past in you, and you stand free of the shackles of sheer stupidity which makes so many women impossible to deal with from a man's standpoint, and which renders it almost necessary for men to estimate them at a low intellectual standard. For even in the supreme passion of love, millions of women are only capable of understanding its merely physical side, while the union of soul with soul is never consummated. Where is that love supreme in which souls meet? Where is it satisfied? Enisled on heaving sands of lone desire, spirit to spirit cries, while float across the skies bright phantoms of fair lands, where fancies fade not and where dreams abide. His voice dropped to the softest musical cadence, and I looked up. He answered my look. "Dear one," he said, "you shall go to the house of Aselzion, and with you will be the future." He let go of my hand very gently. I felt a sudden sense of utter loneliness. You will not misjudge me?" I said. "I? Dear, I have made so many errors of judgment in the past, and I have lost you so many times, that I shall do nothing now which might lose you again." He smiled, and for one moment I was impelled to throw hesitation to the winds and say all that I knew in my inmost self ought to be said. But my rebellious will held me back, and I remained silent, while he turned away and rejoined the rest of the party, with whom he was soon chatting in such a cheery, easy fashion that they appeared to forget that there was anything remarkable about him, or about his wonderful vessel, which had now turned on her course and was carrying us back to Loch Scavaig at a speed which matched the fleetest wind. When she arrived at her former anchorage just opposite the Diana, we saw that all the crew of Mr. Harlan's yacht were on deck watching our movements, which must have been well worth watching, considering what an amazing spectacle the Dream made of herself and her glittering sails against the dark loch and mountains, so brilliant indeed as almost to eclipse the very moon. But the light began to pale as soon as we dropped anchor, and very soon faded out completely, whereupon the sailors hauled down canvas, uttering musical cries as they pulled and braced it together. This work done, they retired, and a couple of servants waited upon our party, bringing wine and fruit as a parting refreshment before we said good night. And once again the sweet voice of the Egyptian boy singer smote upon our ears, with a prelude of harp strings. Good night, farewell! If it should chance that nevermore we meet, remember that the hours we spent together here were sweet. Good night, farewell! If henceforth different ways of life we wend, remember that I sought to walk beside you to the end. Good night, farewell! When present things are merged into the past, remember that I love you and shall love you to the last. My heart beat with a quick and sudden agony of pain. Could it be true that I was of my own accord going to sever myself from one whom I knew, whom I felt to be all in all to me? Good night, said a low voice close to my ear. I started. I had lost myself in a wilderness of thought and memory. Santoris stood beside me. Your friends are going, he said, and I too shall be gone tomorrow. A wave of desolation overcame me. Ah, no, I exclaimed. Surely you will not go? I must, he answered quietly. Are not you going? It has been a joy to meet you, if only for a little while. A pause in the journey, an attempt at an understanding, though you have decided that we must part again. I clasped my hands together in a kind of desperation. What can I do, I murmured, if I yielded now to my own impulses? Ah, if you did, he said wistfully. But you will not, and perhaps after all it is better so. It is no doubt intended that you should be absolutely certain of yourself this time, and I will not stand in the way. Good night, and farewell. I looked at him with a smile, though the tears were in my eyes. I will not say farewell, I answered. He raised my hands lightly to his lips. That is kind of you, he said, and tomorrow you shall hear from me about Aselzion and the best way for you to see him. He is spending the summer in Europe, which is fortunate for you, as you will not have to make so far a journey. We broke off our conversation here as the others joined us, and in a very little while we had left the Dream and were returning to our own yacht. To the last, as the motor launch rushed with us through the water, I kept my eyes fixed on the reposeful figure of Santoris, who, with folded arms on the deck rail of his vessel, watched our departure. Should I never see him again? I wondered. What was the strange impulse that had more or less moved my spirit to a kind of opposition against his, and made me so determined to seek out for myself the things that he assumed to have mastered? I could not tell. I only knew that from the moment he had begun to relate the personal narrative of his own studies and experiences, I had resolved to go through the same training, whatever it was, and learn what he had learned, if such a thing were possible. I did not think I should succeed so well, but some new knowledge I felt I should surely gain. The extraordinary attraction he exercised over me was growing too strong to resist, yet I was determined not to yield to it, because I doubted both its cause and its effect. Love, I knew, could not, as he had said, be analysed, but the love I had always dreamed of was not the love with which the majority of mankind are content, the mere physical delight which ends in satiety. It was something not only for time, but for eternity. Away from Santoris, I found it quite easy to give myself up to the dream of joy which shone before me like the mirage of a promised land. But in his company I felt as though something held me back and warned me to beware of too quickly snatching at a purely personal happiness. We reached the Diana in a very few minutes. We had made the little journey almost in silence, for my companions were, or appeared to be, as much lost in thought as I was. As we descended to our cabins, Mr. Harlan drew me back and detained me alone for a moment. "Santoris is going away tomorrow," he said. "He will probably have set those wonderful sails of his and flown before daybreak. I'm sorry." "So am I," answered. "But after all, you would hardly want him to stay, would you? His theories of life are very curious and upsetting, and you all think him a sort of charlatan playing with the mysteries of earth and heaven. If he is able to read thoughts, he cannot be altogether flattered at the opinion held of him by Dr. Brayle, for example." Mr. Harlan's brows knitted perplexedly. "He says he could cure me of my illness," he went on, "and Brayle declares that a cure is impossible." "You prefer to believe Brayle, of course?" I queried. "Brayle is a physician of note," he replied, "a man who has taken his degree in medicine and knows what he is talking about. Santoris is merely a mystic." I smiled a little sadly. "I see." And I held out my hand to say good night. He is a century before his time, and maybe it is better to die than forestall a century. Mr. Harlan laughed as he pressed my hand cordially. "Enigmatical as usual," he said. "You and Santoris ought to be congenial spirits." "Perhaps we are," I answered carelessly as I left him. "Stranger things than that have happened." End of chapter 11. Chapter 12 of the Life Everlasting by Marie Corelli. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Lisa Statler. A Love Letter. To those who are ignorant of, or indifferent to, the psychic forces working behind all humanity, and creating the causes which evolve into effect, it cannot but seem strange, even eccentric and abnormal, that any one person, or any two persons for that matter, should take the trouble to try and ascertain the immediate intention and ultimate object of their lives. The daily routine of ordinary working, feeding, and sleeping existence, varied by little social conventions and obligations which form a kind of break to the persistent monotony of the regular treadmill round, should be, they think, sufficient for any sane, well-balanced, self-respecting creature. And if a man or woman elects to stand out of the common ruck and say, "I refuse to live in a chaos of uncertainties. I will endeavour to know why my particular atom of self is considered a necessity, if infinitesimal, part of the universe," such an one is looked upon with either distrust or derision. In matters of love especially, where the most ill-assorted halves persist in fitting themselves together as if they could ever make a perfect whole, a woman is considered foolish if she gives her affections where it is not expedient, and a man is looked upon as having ruined his career if he allows a great passion to dominate him, instead of a calm, well-weighed, respectable sort of sentiment, which has its fitting end in an equally calm, well-weighed, respectable marriage. These are the laws and observances of social order, excellent in many respects, but frequently responsible for a great bulk of the misery attendant upon many forms of human relationship. It is not, however, possible to the ordinary mind to realize that somewhere and somehow every two component parts of a whole must come together, sooner or later, and that herein may be found the key to most of the great love tragedies of the world. The wrong halves mated, the right halves finding each other out and rushing together recklessly and inopportunely because of the resistless law which draws them together. This is the explanation of many a life's disaster and despair, as well as of many a life's splendid attainment and victory. and the trouble or the triumph, whichever it be, will never be lessened till human beings learn that in love, which is the greatest and most divine force on earth or in heaven, the soul, not the body, must first be considered, and that no one can fulfill the higher possibilities of his or her nature till each individual unit is conjoined with that only other portion of itself which is as one with it in thought and in the intuitive comprehension of its higher needs. I knew all this well enough, and had known it for years, and it was hardly necessary for me to dwell upon it as I sat alone in my cabin that night, too restless to sleep, and almost too uneasy even to think. What had happened to me was simply that I had, by a curious chance or series of chances, been brought into connection again with the individual soul of a man whom I had known and loved ages ago. To the psychist, such a circumstance does not seem as strange as it is to the great majority of people who realize no greater force than matter, and who have no comprehension of spirit, and no wish to comprehend it, though even the dullest of these often find themselves brought into contact with persons whom they feel they have met and known before, and are unable to understand why they receive such an impression. In my case, I had not only to consider the one particular identity which seemed so closely connected with my own, but also the other individuals with whom I had become more or less reluctantly associated, Catherine, Harlan, and Dr. Brayle especially. Mr. Harlan had, unconsciously to himself, been merely the link to bring the broken bits of a chain together. His secretary, Mr. Swinton, occupied the place of the always necessary non-entity in a group of intellectually or psychically connected beings, and I was perfectly sure, without having any actual reason for my conviction, that if I remained much longer in Catherine Harlan's company, her chance liking for me would turn into the old hatred with which she had hated me in a bygone time, a hatred fostered by Dr. Brayle, who, plainly scheming to marry her and secure her fortune, considered me in the way, as I was, of the influence he desired to exercise over her and her father. Therefore it seemed necessary I should remove myself. Moreover, I was resolved that all the years I had spent in trying to find the way to some of nature's secrets should not be wasted. I would learn, I too, what Raphael Santoris had learned in the house of Aselzion, and then we might perhaps stand on equal ground, sure of ourselves and of each other. So ran my thoughts in the solitude and stillness of the night, a solitude and stillness so profound that the gentle push of the water against the sides of the yacht, almost noiseless as it was, sounded rough and intrusive. My porthole was open, and I could see the sinking moon showing through it like a white face in sorrow. Just then I heard a low plash as of oars. I started up and went to the sofa, where, by kneeling on the cushions, I could look through the porthole. There, gliding just beneath me, was a small boat, and my heart gave a sudden leap of joy as I recognized the man who rowed it as Santoris. He smiled as I looked down, then, standing up in the boat, guided himself alongside till his head was nearly on a level with the porthole. He put one hand on its edge. "Not asleep yet?" he said softly. "What have you been thinking of? The moon and the sea, or any other mystery as deep and incomprehensible?" I stretched out my hand and laid it on his with an involuntary caressing touch. "I could not leave you without another last word," he said, "and I have brought you a letter." He gave me a sealed envelope as he spoke, "which will tell you how to find Aselzion. I myself will write to him also, and prepare him for your arrival. When you do see him, you will understand how difficult is the task you wish to undertake, and, if you should fail, the failure will be a greater sadness to yourself than to me, for I could make things easier for you." "I do not want things made easy for me," I answered quickly. "I want to do all that you have done. I want to prove myself worthy at least." I broke off and looked down into his eyes. He smiled. "Well," he said, "are you beginning to remember the happiness we have so often thrown away for a trifle?" I was silent, though I folded my hand closer over his. The The soft, white, sleepy radiance of the moon on the scarcely moving water around us made everything look dreamlike and unreal, and I was hardly conscious of my own existence for the moment, so completely did it seem absorbed by some other influence stronger than any power I had ever known. "Here are we two," he continued softly, "alone with the night and each other, close to the verge of a perfect understanding, and yet determined not to understand. How often that happens! Every moment, every hour, all over the world, there are souls like ours, barred severally within their own shut gardens, refusing to open the doors. They talk over the walls, through the chinks and crannies, and peep through the keyholes, but they will not open the doors. How fortunate am I tonight to find even a porthole open." He turned up his face, full of light and laughter, to mine, and I thought then how easy it would be to fling away all my doubts and scruples, give up the idea of making any more search for what perhaps I should never find, and take the joy which seemed proffered, and the love which my heart knew was its own to claim. Yet something still pulled me back, and not only pulled me back, but on and away, something which inwardly told me I had much to learn before I dared accept a happiness I had not deserved. Nevertheless, some of my thoughts found sudden speech. "Raphael," I began, and then paused, amazed at my own boldness in thus addressing him. He drew closer to me, the boat he stood in swaying under him. "Go on," he said, with a little tremor in his voice. "My name never sounded so sweetly in my own ears. What is it you would have me do?" "Nothing," I answered, half afraid of myself as I spoke. "Nothing but this. Just to think that I am not merely wilful or rebellious in parting from you for a little while. For if it is true—" "If what is true?" he interposed gently. "If it is true that we are friends not for a time but for eternity," I said in steadier tones, "then it can only be for a little while that we shall be separated, and then afterwards I shall be quite sure—" "Yes, quite sure of what you are sure of now," he said, "as sure as any immortal creature can be of an immortal truth. Do you know how long we have been separated already?" I shook my head, smiling a little. "Well, I will not tell you," he answered. "It might frighten you, but by all the powers of earth and heaven we shall not traverse such distances apart again, not if I can prevent it." "And can you?" I asked, half wistfully. "I can, and I will, for I am stronger than you, and the strongest wins. Your eyes look startled. There are glimpses of the moon in them, and they are soft eyes, not angry ones. I have seen them full of anger, an anger that stabbed me to the heart. But that was in the days gone by, when I was weaker than you. This time the position has changed, and I am the master." "Not yet," I said resolutely, withdrawing my hand from his. "I yield to nothing, not even to happiness, till I know." A slight shadow darkened the attractiveness of his features. "That is what the world says of God. I will not yield till I know. But it is as plastic clay in his hands all the time, and it never knows." I was silent, and there was a pause in which no sound was heard but the movement of the water under the little boat in which he stood. Then, "Good night," he said. "Good night," I answered, and moved by a swift impulse, I stooped and kissed the firm hand that rested so near me, gripping the edge of the porthole. He looked up with a sudden light in his eyes. "Is that a sign of grace and consolation?" he asked, smiling. "Well, I am content, and I have waited so long that I can wait yet a little longer." So speaking, he let go his hold from alongside the yacht, and in another minute had seated himself in the boat and was rowing away across the moonlit water. I watched him as every stroke of the oars widened the distance between us, half hoping that he might look back, wave his hand, or even return again. But no, his boat soon vanished like a small black speck on the sea, and I knew myself to be left alone. Restraining with difficulty the tears that rose to my eyes, I shut the porthole and drew its little curtain across it. Then I sat down to read the letter he had left with me. It ran as follows: "Beloved, I call you by this name as I have always called you through many cycles of time. It should sound upon your ears as familiarly as a note of music struck in response to another similar note in far distance. You are not satisfied with the proofs given you by your own inner consciousness, which testify to the unalterable fact that you and I are and must be as one, that we have played with fate against each other, and sometimes striven to escape from each other, all in vain. It is not enough for you to know, as you do know, that the moment our eyes met, our spirits rushed together in a sudden ecstasy which, had we dared to yield to it, would have outleaped convention, and made of us no more than two flames in one fire. If you are honest with yourself, as I am honest with myself, you will admit that this is so, that the emotion which overwhelmed us was reasonless, formless, and wholly beyond all analysis, yet more insistent than any other force having claim on our lives. But it is not sufficient for you to realize this, or to trace through every step of the journey you have made, the gradual leading of your soul to mine. From that last night you passed in your own home, when every fibre of your being grew warm with the prescience of coming joy, to this present moment, even though dreams of infinite benediction in which I shared. No, it is not sufficient for you. You must know, you must learn, you must probe into deeper mysteries, and study and suffer to the last. Well, if it must be so, it must, and I shall rely on the eternal fitness of things to save you from your own possible rashness and bring you back to me. For without you, now I can do nothing more. I have done much, and much remains to be done, but if I am to attain, you must crown the attainment. If my ambition is to find completion, you alone can be its completeness. If you have the strength and the courage to face the ordeal through which Aselzion sends those who seek to follow his teaching, you will indeed have justified your claim to be considered higher than merest woman, though you have risen above that level already. The lives of women generally, and of men too, are so small and sordid and self-centered, thanks to their obstinate refusal to see anything better or wider than their own immediate outlook, that it is hardly worth while considering them in the light of that deeper knowledge which teaches of the real life behind the seeming one. In the ordinary way of existence, men and women meet and mate with very little more intelligence or thought about it than the lower animals, and the results of such meeting and mating are seen in the degenerate and dying nations of today. Moreover, they are content to be born for no other visible reason than to die, and no matter how often they may be told there is no such thing as death, they receive the assertion with as much indignant incredulity as the priesthood of Rome received Galileo's assurance that the earth moves round the sun. But we, you and I, who know that life, being all life, cannot die, ought to be wiser in our present space of time than to doubt each other's infinite capability for love and the perfect world of beauty which love creates. I do not doubt. My doubting days are past, and the whips of sorrow have lashed me into shape as well as into strength. But you hesitate, because you have been rendered weak by much misunderstanding. However, it has partially comforted me to place the position fully before you, and having done this, I feel that you must be free to go your own way. I do not say, I love you. Such a phrase from me would be merest folly, knowing that you must be mine, whether now or at the end of many more centuries. Your soul is deathless as mine is. It is eternally young as mine is, and the force that gives us life and love is divine and indestructible, so that for us there can be no end to the happiness which is ours to claim when we will. For the rest I leave you to decide. You will go to the house of Aselzion, and perhaps you will remain there some time. At any rate, when you depart from thence, you will have learned much, and you will know what is best for yourself and for me. My beloved, I commend you to God with all my adoring soul, and am your lover, Raphael Santoris. A folded paper fell out of this letter. It contained full instructions as to the way I should go on the journey I intended to make to the mysterious house of Aselzion, and I was glad to find that I should not have to travel as far as I had at first imagined. I began at once to make my plans for leaving the Harlans as soon as possible, and before going to bed I wrote to my friend Francesca, who I knew would certainly expect me to visit her in Invernessshire as soon as my cruise in the Harlan's yacht was over, and briefly stated that business of an important nature called me abroad for 2 or 3 weeks, but that I fully anticipated being at home in England again before the end of October. As it was now just verging on the end of August, I thought I was allowing myself a fairly wide margin for absence. When I had folded and sealed my letter ready for posting, an irresistible sense of sleep came over me, and I yielded to it gratefully. I found myself too overcome by it even to think, and I laid my head down upon the pillows with a peaceful consciousness that all was well, that all would be well, and that in trying to make sure of the intentions of fate toward me, both in life and love, I could not be considered as altogether foolish. Of course, judged by the majority of people, I know I am already counted as worse than foolish for the impressions and experiences I here undertake to narrate, but that kind of judgment does not affect me, seeing that their own daily and hourly folly is so visibly pronounced and has such unsatisfactory and frequently disastrous results, that mine, if it indeed be folly to choose lasting and eternal things rather than ephemeral and temporal ones, cannot but seem light in comparison. Love, as the world generally conceives of it, is hardly worth having, for if we become devoted to persons who must in time be severed from us by death or other causes, we have merely wasted the wealth of our affections. Only as a perfect, eternal, binding force is love of any value, and unless one can be sure in one's own self that there is the strength and truth and courage to make it thus perfect, eternal, and binding, it is better to have nothing to do with what, after all, is the divinest of divine passions, the passion of creativeness, from which springs all thought, all endeavour, all accomplishment. When I woke the next morning, I did not need to be told that the dream had set her wonderful sails and flown. A sense of utter desolation was in the air, and my own loneliness was impressed upon me with overwhelming bitterness and force. It was a calm, brilliant morning, and when I went up on deck, the magnificent scenery of Loch Scavaig was, to my thinking, lessened in effect by the excessive glare of the sun. The water was smooth as oil, and where the Dream had been anchored, showing her beautiful lines and tapering spars against the background of the mountains, there was now a dreary vacancy. The whole scene looked intolerably dull and lifeless, and I was impatient to be away from it. I said as much at breakfast, a meal at which Catherine Harlan never appeared, and where I was accustomed to take the head of the table, at Mr. Harlan's request, to dispense the tea and coffee. Dr. Brayle seemed malignly amused at my remark. "The interest of the place has evidently vanished with Mr. Santoris, so far as you are concerned," he said. "He is certainly a remarkable man, and owns a remarkable yacht, but beyond that I am not sure that his room is not better than his company." "I dare say you feel it so," said Mr. Harlan, who had for some moments been unusually taciturn and preoccupied. "Your theories are diametrically opposed to his, and, for that matter, so are mine. But I confess I should like to have tested his medical skill. He assured me positively that he could cure me of my illness in 3 months." "Why do you not let him try?" suggested Brayle with an air of forced lightness. "He will be a man of miracles if he can cure what the whole medical profession knows to be incurable. But I'm quite willing to retire in his favour if you wish it." Mr. Harlan's bristling eyebrows met over his nose in a saturnine frown. "Well, are you willing?" he said. "I rather doubt it, and if you are not, I'm not. I've no faith in mysticism or psychism of any kind. It bores me to think about it, and nothing has puzzled me at all concerning Santoris except his extraordinarily youthful appearance. That is a problem to me, and I should like to solve it." "He looks about 38 or 40, said Brayle, "and I should say that is his age." "That his age?" Mr. Harlan gave a short derisive laugh. "Why, he's over 60 if he's a day. That's the mystery of it. There's not a touch of years about him. Instead of growing old, he grows young." Brayle looked up quizzically at his patron. "I've already hinted," he said, "that he may not be the Santoris you knew at Oxford. He may be a relative, cleverly masquerading as the original man." "That won't stand a moment's argument," interposed Mr. Harlan, "and I'll tell you how I know it won't. We had a quarrel once, and I slashed his arm with a clasp knife pretty heavily." Here a sudden quiver of something, shame or remorse perhaps, came over his hard face and changed its expression for a moment. "It was all my fault. I had a devilish temper, and he was calm. His calmness irritated me. Moreover, I was drunk. Santoris knew I was drunk, and he wanted to get me home to my rooms and to bed before I made too great a disgrace of myself. Then that happened. I remember the blood pouring from his arm. It frightened me and sobered me. Well, when he came on board here the other night, he showed me the scar of the very wound I had inflicted. So I know he's the same man." We all sat silent. "He was always studying the occult," went on Mr. Harlan, "and I was scarcely surprised that he should think out that antique piece of jewellery from your pocket last night. He actually told me it belonged to you ages ago, when you were quite another and more important person." Dr. Brayle laughed loudly, almost boisterously. "What a fictionist the man must be!" he exclaimed. "Why doesn't he write a novel? Mr. Swinton, I wish you would take a few notes for me of what Mr. Santoris said about that collar of jewels. I should like to keep the record." Mr. Swinton smiled an obliging assent. "I certainly will," he said. "I was fortunately present when Mr. Santoris expressed his curious ideas about the jewels to Mr. Harlan." "Oh well, if you are going to record it," said Mr. Harlan, half laughingly, "you had better be careful to put it all down. The collar, according to Santoris, belonged to Dr. Brayle when his personality was that of an Italian nobleman residing in Florence about the year 1537. He wore it on one unfortunate occasion when he murdered a man, and the jewels have not had much of a career since that period. Now they have come back into his possession." "Father, who told you all this?" The voice was sharp and thin, and we turned round, amazed to see Catherine standing in the doorway of the saloon, white and trembling, with wild eyes looking as though they saw ghosts. Dr. Brayle hastened to her. "Miss Harlan, pray go back to your cabin. You are not strong enough." "What's the matter, Catherine?" asked her father. "I'm only repeating some of the nonsense Santoris told me about that collar of jewels." "It's not nonsense," cried Catherine. "It's all true. I remember it all. We planned the murder together, he and I." And she pointed to Dr. Brayle. "I told him how the lovers used to meet in secret, the poor hunted things. How he, that great artist he patronized, came to her room from the garden entrance at night, and how they talked for hours behind the rose trees in the avenue. And she, I hated her because I thought you loved her. You!" And again she turned to Dr. Brayle, clutching at his arm. "Yes, I thought you loved her, but she loved him, and—" Here she paused, shuddering violently, and seemed to lose herself in chaotic ideas. "And so the yacht has gone, and there is peace, and perhaps we shall forget again. We were allowed to forget for a little while, but it has all come back to haunt and terrify us." And with these words, which broke off in kind of an inarticulate cry, she sank downward in a swoon, Dr. Brayle managing to save her from falling quite to the ground. Everything was at once in confusion, and while the servants were busy hurrying to and fro for cold water, smelling salts, and other reviving cordials, and Catherine was being laid on the sofa and attended to by Dr. Brayle, I slipped away and went up on deck, feeling myself quite overpowered and bewildered by the suddenness and strangeness of the episodes in which I had become involved. In a minute or two Mr. Harlan followed me, looking troubled and perplexed. "What does all this mean?" he said. "I am quite at a loss to understand Catherine's condition. She is hysterical, of course, but what has caused it? What mad idea has she got into her head about a murder?" I looked away from him across the sunlit expanse of sea. "I really cannot tell you," I said at last. "I am quite as much in the dark as you are. I think she is overwrought, and that she has perhaps taken some of the things Mr. Santoris said too much to heart. Then—" here I hesitated. "She said the other day that she was tired of this yachting trip. In fact, I think it is simply a case of nerves." She must have very odd nerves if they persuade her to believe that she and Braille committed a murder together ages ago," said Mr. Harlan irritably. "I never heard of such nonsense in all my life." I was silent. "I have told Captain Derrick to weigh anchor and get out of this," he continued brusquely. "We shall make for Portree at once. There is something witch-like and uncanny about the place," and he looked round as he spoke at the splendour of the mountains shining with almost crystalline clearness in the glory of the morning sun. "I feel as if it were haunted." "By what?" I asked. "By memories," he answered, "and not altogether pleasant ones." I looked at him, and a moment's thought decided me that the opportunity had come for me to broach the subject of my intended departure, and I did so. I said that I felt I had allowed myself sufficient holiday, and that it would be necessary for me to take the ordinary steamer from Portree the morning after our arrival there, in order to reach Glasgow as soon as possible. Mr. Harlan surveyed me inquisitively. "Why do you want to go by the steamer?" he asked. "Why not go with us, back to Rothesay, for example?" "I would rather lose no time," I said. Then I added impulsively, "Dear Mr. Harland, Catherine will be much better when I am gone. I know she will. You will be able to prolong the yachting trip, which will benefit your health, and I should be really most unhappy if you curtailed it on my account." He interrupted me. "Why do you say that Catherine will be better when you are gone?" he demanded. "It was her own most particular wish that you should accompany us." "She did not know what moved her to such a desire," I said. Then, seeing his look of astonishment, I smiled. "I am not a congenial spirit to her, nor to any of you really, but she has been most kind, and so have you, and I thank you ever so much for all you have done for me. You have done much more than you know, only I feel it is better to go now. Now, before—" "Before what?" he asked. "Well, before we all hate each other," I said playfully. "It is quite on the cards that we shall come to that. Dr. Brayle thinks my presence quite as harmful to Catherine as that of Mr. Santoris. I am full of theories which he considers prejudicial, and so, perhaps, they are to him." Mr. Harland drew closer to me where I stood leaning against the deck rail and spoke in a lower tone. "Tell me," he said, "and be perfectly frank about it. What is it you see in Brayle that rouses such a spirit of antagonism in you?" "If I give you a straight answer, such as I feel to be the truth in myself, will you be offended?" I asked. He shook his head. "No," he answered, "I shall not be offended. I simply want to know what you think, and I shall remember what you say and see if it proves correct." "Well, in the first place," I said, "I see nothing in Dr. Brayle but what can be seen in hundreds of worldly minded men such as he. But he is not a true physician, for he makes no real effort to cure you of your illness, while Catherine has no illness at all that demands a cure. He merely humours the weakness of her nerves, a weakness she has created by dwelling morbidly on her own self and her own particular miseries. And all his future plans with regard to her and to you are settled. They are quite clear and reasonable. You will die. In fact, it is, in his opinion, necessary for you to die. It would be very troublesome and inconvenient to him if by some chance you were cured and continued to live. When you are gone, he will marry Catherine, your only child and heiress, and he will have no further personal anxieties. I dislike this self-seeking attitude on his part, and my only wonder is that you do not perceive it. For the rest, my antagonism to Dr. Brayle is instinctive and has its origin far back, perhaps in a bygone existence." He listened to my words with attentive patience. "Well, I shall study the man more carefully," he said, after a pause. "You may be right. At present I think you are wrong. As for any cure for me, I know there is none. I have consulted medical works on the subject, and am perfectly convinced that Brayle is doing his best. He can do no more. And now one word to yourself." Here he laid a hand kindly on mine. "I have noticed, I could not help noticing, that you were greatly taken by Santoris, and I should almost have fancied him rather fascinated by you had I not known him to be absolutely indifferent to womankind. But let me tell you, he is not a safe friend or guide for anyone, His theories are extravagant and impossible. His ideas that there is no death, for example, when death stares us in the face every day, is perfectly absurd. And he is likely to lead you into much perplexity, the more so as you are too much of a believer in occult things already. I wish I could persuade you to listen to me seriously on 1 or 2 points." I smiled. "I am listening," I said. "Well, child, you listen perhaps, but you are not convinced. Realize, if you can, that these fantastic chimeras of a past and future life exist only in the heated imagination of the abnormal idealist. There is nothing beyond our actual sight and immediate living consciousness. We know we are born and that we die, but why we cannot tell and never shall be able to tell. We must try and manage the in-between, the gap dividing birth and death, as best we can, and that's all. I wish you would settle down to these facts reasonably. You would be far better balanced in mind and action." "If I thought as you do," I interrupted him, "I would jump from this vessel into the sea and let the waters close over me. There would be neither use nor sense in living for an in-between leading merely to nothingness." He passed his hand across his brows perplexedly. "It certainly seems useless," he admitted, "but there it is. It is better to accept it than to run amok among inexplicable infinities." We were interrupted here by the sailors busying themselves in preparations for getting the yachts under way, and our conversation being thus broken off abruptly was not again resumed. By 11 o'clock we were steaming out of Loch Scavaig, and as I looked back on the sombre mountain peaks that stood sentinel-wise round the deeply hidden magnificence of Loch Coruisk, I wondered if my visionary experience there had been only the work of my own excited imagination, or whether it really had foundation in fact. The letter from Santoris lay against my heart as actual testimony that he at least was real, that I had met and known him, and that so far as anything could be believed, he had declared himself my lover. But was ever love so expressed? I soon ceased to perplex myself with futile speculations on the subject, however, and as the last peaks of the Scavaig hills vanished in pale blue distance, I felt as if I had been brought suddenly back from a fairyland to a curiously dull and commonplace world. Everyone on board the Diana seemed occupied with the veriest trifles. Catherine remained too ill to appear all day, and Dr. Brayle was in almost constant attendance upon her. A vague sense of discomfort pervaded the whole atmosphere of the yacht. She was a floating palace filled with every imaginable luxury, yet now she seemed a mere tawdry upholsterer's triumph compared with the exquisite grace and taste of the dream, and I was eager to be away from her. I busied myself during the day in packing my things ready for departure with the eagerness of a child leaving school for the holidays, and I was delighted when we arrived at Portree and anchored there that evening. It was after dinner, at about 9 o'clock, that Catherine sent for me, hearing I had determined to go next morning. I found her in her bed, looking very white and feeble, with a scared look in her eyes, which became intensified the moment she saw me. "You are really going away?" she said faintly. "I hope we have not offended you." I went up to her, took her poor thin hand and kissed it. "No, indeed," I answered. "Why should I be offended?" "Father is vexed you are going," she went on. "He says it is all my silly nonsense and hysterical fancies. Do you think it is?" "I prefer not to say what I think," I replied gently. "Dear Catherine, there are some things in life which cannot be explained, and it is better not to try and explain them. But believe me, I can never thank you enough for this yachting trip. You have done more for me than you will ever know, and so far from being offended, I am grateful, grateful beyond all words." She held my hands, looking at me wistfully. "You will go away," she said in a low tone, "and we shall perhaps never meet again. I don't think it likely we shall. People often try to meet again and never do. Haven't you noticed that? It seems fated that they shall only know each other for a little while, just to serve some purpose, and then part altogether. Besides, you live in a different world from ours. You believe in things that I can't even understand. You think there is a God, and you think each human being has a soul." "Are you not taught the same in your churches?" I interrupted. She looked startled. "Oh yes, but then one never thinks seriously about it. You know that if we did think seriously about it, we could never live as we do. One goes to church for convention's sake, because it's respectable. But suppose you were to say to a clergyman that if your soul is immortal, it follows in reason that it must always have existed, and always will exist. He would declare you to be unorthodox. That's where all the puzzle and contradiction comes in, so that I don't believe in the soul at all." "Are you sure that you do not?" I inquired meaningly. She was silent. Then she suddenly broke out. "Well, I don't want to believe in it. I don't want to think about it. I'd rather not. It's terrible. If a soul has never died and never will die, its burden of memories must be awful, horrible. No hell could be worse." "But suppose they are beautiful and happy memories?" I suggested. She shuddered. "They couldn't be. We all fail somewhere." This was true enough, and I offered no comment. "I feel," she went on hesitatingly, "that you are leaving us for some undiscovered country, and that you will reach some plane of thought and action to which we shall never rise. I don't think I am sorry for this. I am not one of those who want to rise. I should be perfectly content to live a few years in a moderate state of happiness and then drop into oblivion, and I think most people are like me." "Very unambitious," I said, smiling. "Yes, I dare say it is, but one gets tired of it all. Tired of things and people, at least I do. Now that man Santoris—" Despite myself, I felt the warm blood flushing my cheeks. "Yes, what of him?" I queried lightly. "Well, I can understand that he has always been alive," and she turned her eyes upon me with an expression of positive dread. "Immensely, actively, perpetually alive! He seems to hold some mastery over the very air. I am afraid of him, terribly afraid. It is a relief to me to know that he and his strange yacht have gone." "But Catherine," I ventured to say, "the yacht was not really strange. It was only moved by a different application of electricity from that which the world at present knows. You would not call it strange if the discovery made by Mr. Santoris were generally adopted?" She sighed. "Perhaps not, but just now it seems a sort of devil's magic to me. Anyhow, I'm glad he's gone. You're sorry, I suppose?" "In a way I am," I answered quietly. "I thought him very kind and charming and courteous. No one could be a better host or a pleasanter companion, and I certainly saw nothing devilish about him. As for that collar of jewels, there are plenty of so-called thought readers who could have found out its existence and said as much of it as he did." She uttered a low cry. "Don't speak of it," she said. "For heaven's sake, don't speak of it!" She buried her face in her pillow, and I waited silently for her to recover. When she turned again towards me, she said, "I am not well yet. I cannot bear too much. I only want you to know before you go away that I have no unkind feeling toward you. Things seem pushing me that way, but I have not really, and you surely will believe me." "Surely," I said earnestly. "Dear Catherine, do not worry yourself. These impressions of yours will pass." "I hope so," she said. "I shall try to forget. And you will meet Mr. Santoris again, do you think?" I hesitated. "I do not know." "You seem to have some attraction for each other," she went on, "and I suppose your beliefs are alike. To me they are dreadful beliefs, worse than barbarism." I looked at her with all the compassion I truly felt. "Why? Because we believe that God is all love and tenderness and justice? Because we cannot think He would have created life only to end in death? Because we are sure that He allows nothing to be wasted, not even a thought, and nothing to go unrecompensed, either in good or in evil? Surely these are not barbarous beliefs?" A curious look came over her face. "If I believed in anything," she said, "I would rather be orthodox and believe in the doctrine of original sin and the atonement." "Then you would start with the idea that the supreme and all-wise Creator could not make a perfect work," I said, "and that He was obliged to invent a scheme to redeem His own failure? Catherine, if you speak of barbarism, that is the most barbarous belief of all." She stared at me, amazed. "You would be put out of any church in Christendom for such a speech as that," she said. "Possibly," I answered quietly, "but I should not and could not be put out of God's universe. Nor, I am certain, would He reject my soul's eternal love and adoration." A silence fell between us. Then I heard her sobbing. I put my arm round her, and she laid her head on my shoulder. "I wish I could feel as you do," she whispered. "You must be very happy. The world is all beautiful in your eyes, and of course with your ideas it will continue to be beautiful, and even death will only come to you as another transition into life. But you must not think anybody will ever understand you, or believe you, or follow you. People will only look upon you as mad, or the dupe of your own foolish imagination." I smiled as I smoothed her pillow for her and laid her gently back upon it. "I can stand that," I said. "If somebody who is lost in the dark jeers at me for finding the light, I shall not mind." We did not speak much after that, and when I said good night to her, I also said goodbye, as I knew I should have to leave the yacht early in the morning. I spent the rest of the time at my disposal in talking to Mr. Harlan, keeping our conversation always on the level of ordinary topics. He seemed genuinely sorry that I had determined to go, and if he could have persuaded me to stay on board a few days longer, I am sure he would have been pleased. "I shall see you off in the morning," he said, "and believe me, I shall miss you very much. We don't agree on certain subjects, but I like you all the same." "That's something," I said cheerfully. "It would never do if we were all of the same opinion." "Will you meet Santoris again, do you think?" This was the same question Catherine had put to me, and I answered it in the same manner. "I really don't know." "Would you like to meet him again?" he urged. I hesitated, smiling a little. "Yes, I think so." "It is curious," he pursued, "that I should have been the means of bringing you together. Your theories of life and death are so alike that you must have thoughts in common. Many years have passed since I knew Santoris. In fact, I had completely lost sight of him, though I had never forgotten his powerful personality, and it seems rather odd to me that he should suddenly turn up again while you were with me." "Mere coincidence," I said lightly, "and common enough after all. Like attracts like, you know." "That may be. There is certainly something in the law of attraction between human beings which we do not understand," he answered musingly. "Perhaps if we did—" He broke off and relapsed into silence. That night, just before going to bed, I was met by Dr. Brayle in the corridor leading to my cabin. I was about to pass him with a brief good night, but he stopped me. "So you are really going tomorrow?" he said, with a furtive narrowing of his eyelids as he looked at me. "Well, perhaps it is best. You are a very disturbing magnet." I smiled. "Am I? In what way?" "I cannot tell you without seeming to give the lie to reason," he answered brusquely. "I believe to a certain extent in magnetism. In fact, I have myself tested its power in purely nervous patients. But I have never accepted the idea that persons can silently, and almost without conscious effort, influence others for either malign or beneficial purposes. In your presence, however, the thing is forced upon me as though it were a truth, while I know it to be a fallacy." "Isn't it too late to talk about such things tonight?" I asked, wishing to cut short the conversation. "Perhaps it is, but I shall probably never have the chance to say what I wish to say," he replied, and he leaned against the stairway just where the light in the saloon sent forth a bright ray upon his face, showing it to be dark with a certain frowning perplexity. "You have studied many things in your own impulsive feminine fashion, and you are beyond all the stupidity of the would-be agreeable female who thinks a prettily feigned ignorance becoming. So that I can speak frankly, I can now tell you that from the first day I saw you, I felt I had known you before, and you filled me with a curious emotion of mingled liking and repulsion. One night, when you were sitting with us on deck, it was before we met that fellow Santoris, I watched you with singular interest. Every turn of your head, every look of your eyes seemed familiar, and for a moment I almost loved you. Oh, you need not mind my saying this," and he laughed a little at my involuntary exclamation. "It was nothing, it was only a passing mood, for in another few seconds I hated you as keenly. There you have it. I do not know why I should have been visited by these singular experiences, but I own they exist. That is why I am rather glad you are going." "I am glad too," I said, and I held out my hand in parting. "I should not like to stay where my presence caused a moment's uneasiness or discomfort." "That's not putting it quite fairly," he answered, taking my offered hand and holding it loosely in his own. "But you are an avowed psychist, and in this way you are a little uncanny. I should not like to offend you." "You could not if you tried," I said quickly. "That means I am too insignificant in your mind to cause offence," he observed. "I dare say I am. I live on the material plane, and am content to remain there. You are essaying very high flights and ascending among difficulties of thought and action which are entirely beyond the useful and necessary routine of life. And in the end these things may prove too much for you." Here he dropped my hand. "You bring with you a certain atmosphere which is too rarefied for ordinary mortals. It has the same effect as the air of a very high mountain on a weak heart. It is too strong. One loses breath and the power to think coherently. You produce this result on Miss Harland, and also to some extent on me, even slightly on Mr. Harland, and poor Swinton alone does not fall under the spell, having no actual brain to impress. You need someone who is accustomed to live in the same atmosphere as yourself to match you in your impressions and opinions. We are on a different range of thought and feeling and experience, and you must find us almost beyond endurance." "As you find me," I interposed, smiling. "I will not say that, no, for there seems to have been a time when we were all on the same plane." He paused, and there was a moment's tense silence. The little silvery chime of a clock in the saloon struck 12. "Good night, Dr. Brayle," I said. He lifted his brooding eyes and looked at me. "Good night. If I have annoyed you by my scepticism in certain matters, you must make allowances for temperament and pardon me. I should be sorry if you bore me any ill will." What a curious note of appeal there was in his voice! All at once it seemed to me that he was asking me to forgive him for that long ago murder which I had seen reflected in a vision, and my blood grew suddenly heated with an involuntary wave of deep resentment. "Dr. Brayle," I said, "pray do not trouble yourself to think any more about me. Our ways will always be apart, and we shall probably never see each other again. It really does not matter to you in the least what my feeling may be with regard to you. It can have no influence on either your present or your future. Friendships cannot be commanded." "You will not say," he interrupted me, "that you have no dislike of me?" I hesitated, then spoke frankly. "I will not," I answered, "because I cannot." For one instant our eyes met, then came something between us that suggested an absolute and irretrievable loss. "Not yet," he murmured, "not yet." And with a forced smile he bowed and allowed me to pass to my cabin. I was glad to be there, glad to be alone, and overwhelmed as I was by the consciousness that the memories of my soul had been too strong for me to resist, I was thankful that I had had the courage to express my invincible opposition to one who had, as I seemed instinctively to realize, been guilty of an unrepented crime. That night I slept dreamlessly, and the next morning, before 7 o'clock, I had left the luxurious Diana for the ordinary passenger steamer plying from Portree to Glasgow. Mr. Harland kept his promise of seeing me off, and expressed his opinion that I was very foolish to travel with a crowd of tourists and other folk, when I might have had the comfort and quiet of his yacht all the way. But he could not move me from my resolve, though in a certain sense I was sorry to say good-bye to him. "You must write to us as soon as you get home," he said at parting. "A letter will find us this week at Gairloch. I shall cruise about a bit longer." I made no reply for the moment. He had no idea that I was not going home at all, nor did I intend to tell him. "You shall hear from me as soon as possible," I said at last, evasively. "I shall be very busy for a time." He laughed. "Oh, I know! You are always busy. Will you ever get tired, I wonder?" I smiled. "I hope not." With that we shook hands and parted, and within the next 20 minutes the steamer had started, bearing me far away from the Isle of Skye, that beautiful, weird and mystic region full of strange legends and memories, which to me had proved a veritable wonderland. I watched the Diana at anchor in the Bay of Portree till I could see her no more, and it was getting on towards noon when I suddenly noticed the people on board the steamer making a rush to one side of the deck to look at something that was evidently both startling and attractive. I followed the crowd, and my heart gave a quick throb of delight when I saw poised on the sparkling waters the fairy-like Dream. her sails white as the wings of a swan, and her cordage gleaming like woven gold in the brilliant sunshine. She was a thing of perfect beauty, as she seemed to glide on the very edge of the horizon, like a vision between sky and sea. And as I pressed forward among the thronging passengers to look at her, she dipped her flag in salutation, a salutation I knew was meant for me alone. When the flag ran up again to its former position, murmurs of admiration came from several people around me. "The finest schooner afloat," I heard one man remark. "They say she goes by electricity as well as sailing power." "She's often seen about here," said another. "She belongs to a foreigner, some prince or other named Santoris." And I watched and waited, with unconscious tears in my eyes, till the exquisite fairy vessel disappeared suddenly, as though it had become absorbed and melted into the sun. Then all at once I thought of the words spoken by the wild Highland Jamie, who had given me the token of the bell heather. "One way in and another way out, one road to the west and the other to the east, and round about to the meeting place." The meeting place, where would it be? I could only think and wonder, hope and pray, as the waves spread their silver foaming distance between me and the vanished dream. End of chapter 12.